On this episode of the podcast, I have with me David Relyea. He is the Director of Data Science at BlackBerry. We're going to cover a couple of different topics. He has a fantastic career so far, has had numerous head of and director of roles. And we're going to talk about, what skill sets he wishes he probably could have picked up a little bit sooner. Now, once you become a manager, you kind of are deep into it and you're hoping to, by osmosis, learn from those around you or who you've had as managers. And we'll kind of pick David's mind in terms of areas that he could see as opportunities to pick up skills earlier. And also, he did have a Ph.D. and has made a great transition to industry. I'd like to kind of talk to him a little bit about that trajectory. And overall, just excited to have him on the podcast. David, thanks for being on.
Hey, man, thanks.
Absolutely.
So right now, I'm the Director of Data Science at BlackBerry. And before this, I've worked in fintech. I worked at Kensho, which is now owned by S&P Global. Before that, I worked at OpenX, which is an ad tech firm. I've worked in defense, and I've consulted for a whole bunch of places around the Los Angeles area. So that's sort of my background in a nutshell. That was all after physics, of course, once I got out of it. So,
absolutely. I guess you're talking about physics. I know I mentioned you made the transition. I actually get lots of, not lots, a couple requests per month about having guests talk about that transition, because I think people in academia, going through their PhDs have a very formal avenue and path that's kind of in front of them to kind of continue. Going into industry isn't always, right there. I guess when you kind of look back at it, did you actually stay within the research academia side before leaving, or what was your trajectory like?
I jumped ship before machine learning was really a big thing, or right as it was about becoming a big thing. And I moved over to a defense contractor, so I was still doing a bunch of physics there, but that contractor was doing both physics and a lot of machine learning. So I was able to hybridize pretty quickly there. So that was kind of a unique experience. There's a lot of people right now that come out of their PhDs or postdocs, by the way, there's a lot of postdocs as well, who don't have all of the skills that people, getting a PhD in CS or a PhD directly in machine learning or AI might be getting. And so I usually, for those people, recommend that they I give them I often, if I get an applicant for a job and they're really smart, but they don't have necessarily the requisite skill set, I'll often give them hey, here's a list of things that you need to really brush up on and learn. Things that include the standard stuff, Coursera's machine learning and deep learning courses. One that's a little odd is the Coursera How to Win a Machine Learning Competition course, because although I don't care about Kaggle at all, getting that crunchy experience of what to actually do with data is something that a lot of people getting their PhDs just don't ever have the opportunity to have. They deal with one data set, their own niche problem for a long time. And so they just don't know how to deal with disparate data sets in the real world. I also send them a bunch of books, the Hasty book, Bishop, the deep learning book, stuff like that, and just let them go off and learn all of that stuff, because really that's basically the standard curriculum. And if you're a PhD and you're getting your degree, you should be able to pick all that stuff up pretty quickly.
Absolutely. I guess when you kind of look at it, now obviously, it's pretty interesting. You provide lots of, content material, lots of insights into making that transition easier. When you look back at yourself, did you experience similar, or was it more a case of just trial by fire?
No, it was all trial by fire. It was I did have to teach myself all of it. Nobody ever taught me machine learning or deep learning or anything like that. I was learning, I coded the first CNN from, basically machine learning. We learned really early on at this contractor that the stuff that we were doing was involving a bunch of finding really small signals and a huge amount of noise and basically doing a bunch of classification. And to do that, we had to learn to do machine learning properly. And that was something that everyone at the higher end boutique shops was slowly starting to realize. So there were a bunch of resources, right? It's not like there was nothing on the table. Hasty existed as a book. There's a bunch of other stuff. So you just, pick these things up and read them. This was before AlexNet. This was back in 08, 09, 10, those sorts of times. And so once AlexNet actually came out, and once they won the competition ImageNet in 2012, anyone who was paying attention at that moment suddenly realized, oh man, neural nets are real. Anyone who said they were working in neural nets before that, I always look at them a little skeptically, because the number of people that were actually working in neural nets for real at that period of time, you could count on a few hands. But once AlexNet sort of took one ImageNet, everyone realized, oh, this is real. And you just had to really quickly run the papers and start implementing stuff as fast as possible so that if your company did image processing, for instance, you had a leg up on your competition. And if your company was doing like stuff where smaller nets, like smaller feed forward nets would be useful, you could actually, apply those immediately as opposed to going because for instance, like Scikit sklearn existed, but like everyone was using random forests. The GBM in that was really slow at that period of time, and it would like GBM and XGBoost didn't exist yet, and so it was all ultimately a trial by fire.
Absolutely. Do you notice, I guess, since then, as you kind of went through that yourself, and I like to ask this because I'm always curious, but, and you see other people coming out of programs or postdocs, as you mentioned, has much changed? I mean, you're obviously trying to provide some insight and some guidance and some mentorship to anyone you can, but do you see people coming out any more prepared than they were when you were coming out of it?
Yeah, there's actually a much broader spectrum. There's people, not to cause people to panic, but I will say this straight up. There's people in high schools right now with more experience in machine learning that are more hireable than people who are PhDs. I've met them. That's straight up true. When you get a field that's white hot like this one that moves really fast, you will end up with this weird inversion of talent versus seniority where all of the really young people are grabbing the most recent stuff and learning it. Whereas the more senior people, you saw this a decade ago, like the people doing machine learning versus the people doing statistics. All the people that had been doing statistics for a decade or two were comfortable to sit on their laurels and, oh, this is what I do. And anyone who was new started picking up machine learning and soon made mincemeat of the statisticians in terms of their capabilities to perform things like, I mean, not linear regression, obviously, but to perform like classification or to perform like complicated, not just like L2 regressions, but like complicated predictions of numerical quantities. Same thing is true today. There are lots of people now. It's true that like academia is slowly catching up as well. So like there are people coming out of PhD programs who've actually been doing machine learning for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And the number of people that had been doing that, say 5 years ago, was much, much smaller. And the number of people doing that 5 years before that was much smaller than that. So there's a much broader spectrum overall. There are still a lot of people coming out of the pure sciences with very little, knowledge about machine learning other than, oh, that's what I want to do. And they might have had a smattering of hands-on experience. But then there's a lot of people who have just been doing the hands-on crunchy stuff for a longer period of time. So the spectrum of people's capabilities has broadened substantially.
Interesting. I guess from the standpoint of you're moving into, through your career now that, you transition to management and obviously there's certain responsibilities. You moved into the industry, you got into machine learning, kind of ramped up on your own. As you make that move into management, what was that process like for you? Were you actually, proactively, getting any training, any insights, or was it another case of, trial by fire? Hey, we need a manager, you're it, and you're kind of up the plate.
Now it's just, I mean, after a while, the fact is there's project management and personnel management, and they are very distinct in terms of ultimately the broad array of things that you're going to encounter in both that you're going to have to handle. But at a first glance, at like the most superficial read, they're very similar. Basically, if you don't have a lot of what I would call like personnel issues where an employee is having like, personal problems in their, non-work life or, all sorts of things that a manager needs to handle and your employees are fairly stable otherwise, then managing them as a tech lead or a project lead and managing them as a personnel lead is somewhat similar, except you of course have to deal with HR and you have to like be the conduit between your employee and HR. But I was lucky in that the first few employees that I ever had at various shops all were very, very nice people that were all very friendly, and none of them had significant issues that I had to like really manage my way through. And as a result, it was I won't say a trial by fire, it was a trial by nice, lukewarm water. Like it was just a trial by bathwater. It was really, really easy to be able just to transition into that role. And then as time progressed and I got to handle a broader array of people, I got to deal with more telling problems that managers have to deal with. So
Interesting. I like that. Try by lukewarm water. That's a big difference from your entry into the actual industry. When you're looking at hiring people on, and you're actually trying to evaluate fit for your team and looking at those things, I guess when you look at the fact that you came in and you had the right type of team set up, obviously you don't want to disrupt the ship and you want to keep a even keel on your team. Are there now like certain personality traits or certain kind of tells that would excel more in your team setup versus another?
There's millions. I mean, there's no question. There's a huge array of like, it's the fact is that hiring people is a fun thing where you've got to find everyone, all the junior people think it's just about like your hard skills. And so they go out and they brush up on all their code academy and their hacker rank and they brush up on all their machine learning. They get that huge array of technical knowledge in their heads. But there are so many other skill sets that are so absolutely important for success at a company, and you in your hiring you have to sort of ascertain. And one thing that's interesting about hiring, which most people don't realize, is that nearly all of hiring is figuring out every area in which your candidate might fail, being super thorough about that, and finding the few candidates that haven't failed your interviews because they don't have any of those red flags or any of those gaps. A lot of hiring is just trying to suss out those gaps. And there are just as many like soft skill gaps as there are technical gaps, but there's a huge array of gaps that you try to suss out.
Absolutely. You know what always becomes interesting to me is obviously you're trying to figure those out before you bring somebody on, and how long you might be able to look for that right fit versus at some point going, it's pretty close. I need somebody in to help the team. Always a tricky balance, right? You're not going to hire somebody substandard in terms of, an area that you're looking for, but also, you know, time works against you potentially. Is there any views in terms of that trade-off of how long you can comfortably wait until you've got to bring somebody in?
No, I haven't hit that problem. I would never hire somebody as a stopgap. If you're bringing someone new into the company, now there's a difference between like hiring versus like moving somebody between teams in a company. The latter is different and fraught with a separate set of difficulties. But if you're bringing someone into the company, I won't hire someone with gaps just because, oh, we need a warm body. And so we'll figure out a way through these things. You have to make sure that you get the right employees because it is very, very costly to bring on bad employees.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's funny because I think a lot of times people want the process to go faster, and that cost of that negative hire is probably way more impactful than I think there's some, obviously numbers and studies done that kind of tie into that. But yeah, I think a lot of times people want things to move faster, and you're like, well, I need to keep growing the team with the right talent, not just a person that's going to, do job B, and then what's going to happen then, and a whole assortment of issues that you have to deal with that are probably worth the short term game. In terms of when you're looking to hire and you've brought somebody on, obviously we were talking about, management skills that you're hoping to pick up, and you had a pretty good team. When you're actually looking to help somebody grow their skills, right? Like, what's that process like for you? Obviously, you see somebody talented could potentially be a lead, a manager one day. Is there something or anything that you've seen that, you'd start to maybe pick up on and kind of help that person?
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of tiered ways to grow people's skills, right? Like one thing I want to start earlier than that, which is like with your really junior candidates, because there's such a diverse array of positions available for people to do machine learning and data science. There's a lot of positions that just say data science, where you're doing soup to nuts, everything from the front to the back. But there's a lot of positions that say data science where you're just doing BI, where there's no cost function and you're just making your executives happy by providing them like smart visualizations. There's machine learning engineering positions that run the gamut from nothing but software engineering and you'll never touch a model, all the way through to effectively you're doing all the soup to nuts anyway. You have a different title. There's machine learning researcher positions like that. And so the skills that translate across all of those things, there's ones that like a lot of researchers don't like sort of bristle at. What I'm driving at in this whole thing is that no matter what level that someone's at a company, there's often skill sets that they have not picked up yet because they have bristled at them, because they have felt for whatever reason that those skill sets are unimportant. And those are often the things that you need to grow in those employees as they're moving up the totem pole. So for instance, I know so many people, I know software engineers that have not read just like the basic Bibles of coding, like clean code and refactoring and pragmatic programmer. Without that knowledge, every single person in the world that does machine learning is programming. I don't care whether your title is researcher or engineer or even business analyst, you're doing programming. And if your code is awful and unmaintainable, you're just going to slow yourself down. It's things like being able to teach them to properly run analyses and experiments, because a lot of people are weirdly, when they get to the point where they're evaluating what they've done, they get really lazy and they just pretend that they just, compare A versus B. They don't think about statistics. They don't think about bias. They just sort of ignore it and say A is greater than B, so it's better. And for those people out there who are smart, who have a lot of statistics in their heads, I'd like to point out that bias and the systematics in your data set are nearly always more important than the statistics. So if you're evaluating your error just based on your statistics, you're doing it entirely wrong. Automation is a thing which a lot of people don't pick up. So these are all technical skills, right? Like knowing an IDE code, but the soft skills as well, which are things that for like a leadership position, people don't tend to have absorbed entirely. They're a broad spectrum. They fall into a few distinct categories. One of those categories is things like just pure communication skills. How do you transfer information, not only within your team, but how do you transfer information to peer teams? How do you transfer information up the chain? How do you transfer information to yourself a year in the future, which everyone calls documentation, but we have to understand that you in the future will not go back and remember what you did perfectly unless you manage to have some sort of like system in place so that you can very quickly pair over whatever you'd written down and understand exactly what it was that you were doing to be able to address your future problems, right? So communications like that, the proactive, knowing your audience and knowing how you address people, and how you should like tailor your message so that your audience, it's answering all of their fundamental questions. That's something that a lot of researchers don't do. It's something that a lot of like tech people don't do in general. They just tend to write down all of the facts and think they've communicated something. And that's rather poor. There's things like efficiency and scalability and processes like that. There are a lot of tech people that think about scalability of their code and scalability of the routines that they run. But to become a leader, you have to think about scalability of like your actual efforts, right? Like, how are you scaling within a company? How is what your team is working on? How is the scope of that scaling within the company appropriately? That's not something that people tend to think a lot about. Very few people tend to consciously think about their blockers. A lot of people think about debt and how to prevent debt, although a lot is not the majority, but that's a thing. But most people don't ever think about their blockers and how to prevent themselves from getting blocked. That's something that hurts a lot of technical people. Even at the highest levels, you'll have technical people that don't bother getting requirements ahead of time because they know how to do something technically and they won't listen to the product people. And as a result, they will end up wasting a lot of their time effectively, so it's an efficiency thing. And also they're blocking their ability to do future work in an area because they built something out that meets a different set of requirements. There's a lot of things. I mean, there's just like knowing your marketplace, knowing your competitors, things like that. There's all the behavioral attributes, things like proactivity. Consistency is a huge one. Many people are very inconsistent in what they do. The ability to work without guidance, the ability to handle context switching is a huge one. There are lots of people who want to become managers and tech leads. And for some of them, I bristle immediately knowing that they won't succeed because whenever you give them more than one thing to do, they start to flail. And being a manager, being a director, being a VP is all about the ability to context switch rapidly all day. It becomes your entire job to do nothing but subsume way more context than you're used to at the individual contributor level and that you're used to at like lower levels of scope. And so the ability to switch between all those contexts rapidly becomes really important. That is a skill set that can be learned if you bother like learning it and if you bother putting yourself into that situation, or if you work with your boss to get them to put you into that situation. But that's one that most people don't realize they need to like work on. Other things like learning habits, those are just obvious. Things like how do you handle requirements? These are the ones that people typically understand. So there's a giant list like that. We can chat about any of that if you want to. I know that was like a dictionary almost of everything that I put out. So
No, that's actually awesome. I was actually going to ask you, and again, that's a great list of things that I think a lot of people who are either new in a role or even a couple of years in, that's great to pick up on, especially if you have eyes to want to move into management. But I guess, have you ever come across a scenario where you just know someone's not made for management and you have to kind of talk about alternative paths and kind of maybe steer somebody towards maybe more architecture versus people managing?
I haven't had anyone who's really wanted to manage people who's been atrocious with people. if I encountered somebody like that, it would be a very easy and short conversation in which I pointed out. So this is the thing about moving up the chain of command and increasing your scope is that ultimately there's things that people don't like to do. I'm going to use Jira as an example because that's an easy one that usually hits a lot of people. A lot of technical people don't understand, like machine learning people, data science people don't understand that Jira is a way for you to communicate with both your peers and your peer teams and up the chain as well, exactly where your efforts are going. And it's not just an efficiency or time management system, it's a communication system. And a lot of people, as a result, really hate Jira. I've met so many technical people, not software developers, but machine learning people who just loathe Jira and don't want to do it. And the thing about it is that when those people say, oh, hey, I want to start becoming a tech lead, the easiest thing I can do in that conversation is say, okay, cool. So do you want to start running Jira for the following projects? And then you can watch the wheels in their head turn as they realize, oh, that bitter pill that I've never wanted to swallow is a massive part of what I'd be doing. The same thing is true with personnel. Like if there's people that are really, really bad with people for whatever reason, like if there's people that don't like conflict and they say, hey, I want to manage people, the easiest thing to do is say, good, let's go have you work with the coworkers that are like high conflict coworkers, right? And let them realize, oh, that's going to be a big part of the job. Having people face those things head on early is the easiest way for them to either get past those things that they're bad at because it'll teach them to learn those things, or it'll teach them that, oh, that's not a direction I can move my career in because I don't want to do those things, you know?
Absolutely. And it's interesting is that I think it's just, I don't know where the construct has come from, but people get more experience and naturally they think the further and further steps are into management, right? I mean, some people realize, well, no, I want to stay into technical leadership and they kind of recognize that. But for most people, it's like, well, or at least at some point you think I've got to be a manager or I need to move into management just to kind of round out and fulfill my overall career path. And I don't know if that's no longer necessary. I think maybe there's been a shift and now people can kind of view staying technical and technology leadership as a different path than maybe previously thought.
There's a lot of aspects to that. I mean, obviously, managerial salaries are typically, and it really depends at the shop you're at. It strongly depends at the shop you're at. So there are lots of bigger shops where the IC, the individual contributor route, is definitely as well compensated as a managerial route. And those shops are doing everything right because they don't have a perverse incentive scheme where people that would be really bad managers are incentivized to want to become managers just to increase their salary. There are also smart shops out there that understand that having people work as personnel managers should not sometimes increase their scope of the things that they're touching within a company for particular reasons. Sometimes people are really good at communication, but bad at strategy. And sometimes people are really good at people, but they're really bad at understanding the value of various efforts. So there's companies that learn to mitigate those things successfully as well. For people that want to quote unquote round out their career, you got to break down why you want to do that. Is it because of the salary? Is it because of the scope that you want to be touching? Is it because, you want a force multiplier? And the question is the personnel management really the thing you want to do to have the force multiplication, or the tech managerial position instead give you the same ability to be a force multiplier? Management of people is a lot about, as I said, it's a lot about context switching and a lot about strategy as well. So if they really want to touch strategy, but they're at a lower level, sometimes the better thing to do is to bring them in on strategic discussions just so they can listen and participate in those discussions without having to actually manage people, so that they get the ability to participate in the strategic discussion, as I said, without having to manage people and without having that slate of responsibilities. Ultimately, I mean, like everything else, it is when we talk about management, we're conflating several things that are incentivizing people and several things that motivate people. When we talk about machine learning, we conflate a lot of different things. So we have to learn to break these things down and discuss them all individually so that people understand exactly what they want to do in their career long term, what motivates them. And then, if for the specific things that motivate them where they have gaps, how to fill those gaps.
I guess just to piggyback off that, I mean, what might be best for an organization is to realize that somebody is awfully skilled at as an engineer, and maybe there's a path that they create for that person because they realize that there's an immense value to having a different path than somebody who, let's say, who eventually would be designated to go into management because that's the only path available. So obviously, if you're going through and, for some places it's, manager, they can become a principal. In some places it's, depending on the org structure, you become a lead and then we got to make them manager. And sometimes it's like, well, maybe a different path would have been better for the org and for the employee actually.
Yeah, but again, we got to remember that conflating the org's needs with your own personal needs is dangerous. And that's extremely important. What you just said is the reason so many employees end up getting their careers held back is because the org says, oh, you'd be a fantastic architect, or you'd be a fantastic, the org saying, I have this need and you would fit that need really well, and not tying that into the employee's base motivations. I've seen so many managers trying to convince employees that they need to be doing A rather than B, whereas the employee's base motivations are to do B all the time. And really, that's extremely bad in the long run because you end up with an employee who's just fundamentally unhappy and you just end up with a really bad situation. The company may be happy with that for a while, but you're just ultimately building up the debt of having an employee who is going to leave at some point because they're not happy with you. And you're also slowly building up a source of bad morale within your company. And so those things you have to be very wary when you have disparate needs between the company and the employee. Hopefully your company is broad enough so that you can actually find an area where that employee can fulfill their needs and actually benefit the company. Because if you can't, then you have to start thinking about who do we hire on to actually do this employee's job, and how do we have this employee go to a company where they'd be happier.
You know what? We see the movement as recruiters, and I could tell you a lot of times that does come up. And I don't know when there's going to be a shift. I guess it's in process, right? Some organizations are seeing it, some are not. But I definitely think one of the big reasons people leave is there's definitely, divergent views of where somebody's career should head. And, an employee is forced to leave, right? They've got to find something that fits better. So I agree with you. That's a big problem. And I don't know if a ton of people are solving that correctly, but obviously there's more avenues now. I mean, I think, 10, 15, 20 years ago, there's far less paths that you could possibly go down versus what we have now as options.
Yeah, there's a lot more things. I mean, that's in this space, it's white hot as a result. And because it's so broad, because it's touching so many different things, there's just so many ways. You now can have people hybridize themselves in all sorts of ways that they couldn't before, which is great.
And then I think what I've started to see now is, the data scientist or the ML or AI engineer who's turning into product manager, and they come at it with a whole different skill set because they actually had done the job and they just have a different view and vision of that product manager role than traditionally we had before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very interesting. I was just looking at the clock and I'm like, man, time has flown by, cognizant that you've got to get back to your day. But I want to thank you for being on the podcast and chatting with us. If someone has a question, and I think, we'll definitely put whatever social contacts you want in the podcast show notes, is there a preferred social medium to reach out to you by?
Yeah, totally. Professionally, through LinkedIn is the best. So anyone can email me there. That'd be great.
So we'll put that there. If you heard anything that David has talked about that you want to follow up with them, feel free to reach out via LinkedIn, and we'll drop his LinkedIn profile on the show notes for everyone. But that's it for this week. Thank you, David, for being on. Fantastic content and insight across the board. I appreciate it very much. And we will be back again next week, different guests, and we'll provide hopefully some more content for you guys to enjoy. And as always, I ask for two things. If you could possibly, subscribe to the podcast. That's how this thing has grown. I was just looking at the numbers, and it's kind of crazy that we're getting several hundred listens an episode. And I didn't think that was possible. And it's just been awesome with having fantastic guests. So any feedback anyone has, I'd love to hear it. Want to improve the podcast and subscribe to the episodes, just because that's the only other way we'll actually keep this thing growing. So until next time, thank you.